The gavel slams, but this time, it's her dignity cracking. Pam Bondi, the woman who once held Florida's justice system in her palm, stares down a courtroom packed with smirking rivals and reporters hungry for blood. "Counselor Bondi," the judge drawls, voice dripping with mock pity, "perhaps you've forgotten how the law works." The insult hangs, jagged and deliberate. Her client, a single mother sued for debt she didn't owe, whimpers beside her. Cameras zoom. Opposing counsel grins. For a heartbeat, Bondi's face is a mask, until her fingers brush the manila envelope on the table. Inside, not just evidence, dynamite. Because here's the truth about hunters. They never see the trap, until the jaws snap shut. And Bondi? She'd spent 20 years learning how to build better traps. By sundown, that smirk would be hers, the gavel, a weapon in her hand. And the law, the very system that betrayed her, would become the rope that hanged them all. The courtroom had always been Bondi's stage. As Florida's former attorney general, she'd stood before judges like this one, Judge Harold Crane, a bloated relic of old money Tallahassee, dozens of times. Back then, they'd called her Madam General, laughed at her heels, whispered about her ambition but feared her. Now? Crane's smirk said it all. He leaned back in his leather chair, bought with donations from the very law firm now eviscerating her client, and let his gaze crawl over Bondi like she was a misbehaving intern. "Ms. Bondi." Crane sighed, adjusting his robes like a king settling into a throne. "Your client," he spat the word, nodding at the trembling woman beside her, "has failed to provide any evidence of fraud. Again." The gallery tittered. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. They weren't here for the case. They were here for the spectacle, the once untouchable Bondi reduced to defending a nobody against Goliath. Her client, Maria Gonzalez, gripped Bondi's wrist under the table. A nurse, a widow, a mother of two who'd inherited her late husband's medical debt, $200,000 of it, magically transferred to her name after a paperwork error buried in the fine print of a predatory loan. The creditors? Crestview Holdings, a shell company owned by Roderick Voss, a billionaire developer who'd donated 6 figures to Crane's last campaign. Bondi had seen this playbook before. Hell, she'd written parts of it. But never from this side of the table. Across the aisle, Crestview's lead counsel, Carter Blythe, flashed Bondi a grin sharp enough to cut glass. Mid-40s. Ivy League. A shark who'd made partner by burying families like Maria's under avalanches of legal fees. He'd been waiting years for this moment, to humiliate the woman who'd once denied his firm a state contract. "Your Honor," Blythe purred, rising with performative pity. "We'd be happy to settle. Ms. Gonzalez can repay just 80% of the debt. A mercy, really." Mercy. The word hung like a noose. Maria stifled a sob. Bondi's nails dug into her palm. She knew Blythe's game. Drag this out. Bleed Maria dry. Make Bondi beg. Because this wasn't about money. It was about power. About proving that even the mighty fall and stay fallen. But Bondi had always been a student of power. 6 months earlier, she'd taken Maria's case pro bono, a favor for an old friend. But when she dug into Crestview's records, she'd found rot, shell companies, forged signatures, a trail of errors that always seemed to prey on women, immigrants, anyone without the means to fight back. And Judge Crane, his daughter's luxury condo, paid for by a consulting firm linked to Voss. She'd tried to play by the rules, filed motions, subpoenaed records, but every door slammed shut. Crane blocked evidence. Blythe drowned her in procedural delays. The press painted her as a has-been chasing relevance. Even former allies ghosted her calls. "You're making enemies," Pam, one warned. "Let it go." But Bondi had never been good at letting go. "Ms. Bondi?" Crane's voice snapped her back. He was standing now, jowls quivering. "Unless you have actual evidence, I do." The room stilled. Bondi didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. She slid the manila envelope across the table. Inside, Not just the forged loan documents, but bank records, emails, a recording of Voss laughing to Blythe about burying the bitch in paperwork. Evidence that could have ended this case months ago, if the system hadn't been rigged. Crane froze. Blythe's grin faltered. "Your Honor," Bondi said, smooth as a blade, "I move to introduce Exhibit 17A, proof that Crestview Holdings intentionally falsified debt records and that this court has willfully ignored it." Maria gasped. Blythe shot up. "Objection, this is a stunt." But Bondi was already turning to the cameras. Let them roll. Let the world see. Because she'd finally realized the truth. The law wasn't broken. It was a weapon. And she'd spent years sharpening it for the wrong hands. Crane pounded his gavel, face purple. "You're out of line, counselor." "Am I?" Bondi held up a photo, Crane's daughter waving from the balcony of that Miami condo. "Or are you just afraid they'll see what happens when justice stops being for sale?" The gallery erupted. Maria's hand tightened on Bondi's arm, no longer trembling. Hoping. Somewhere in the chaos, a single thought crystallized. Bondi wasn't just fighting for Maria anymore. She was fighting for every person who'd ever been told they were too small to matter, too poor to win, too powerless to demand answers. And the best part? They still didn't see her coming. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order! Order!" Crane's roar drowned the chaos, but the damage was done. Bondi stood frozen as bailiffs swarmed the gallery, seizing phones, yanking cameras downward. Blythe shouted over the din, demanding sanctions, disbarment, retribution. Maria clung to Bondi's arm, her hope curdling into terror. "They're deleting the footage," she whispered. Bondi didn't need to look. She'd seen this before, the quiet erasure of inconvenient truths. Crane's ruling came swift and brutal. "Exhibit 17A is stricken from the record," he spat, glaring at Bondi as if she'd hauled garbage into his courtroom. "Counselor Bondi, consider this a final warning. One more stunt and I'll have you jailed for contempt." The gallery emptied like a sinking ship. Reporters scurried, already spinning the narrative. Disgraced AG bombshell fizzles. Blythe lingered, smirking as he packed his crocodile leather briefcase. "Should have stayed retired, Pam," he murmured. "Now everyone gets to watch you fail." Maria collapsed into a hallway bench outside, head in her hands. "They'll take my house, my kids." "They won't." Bondi's voice sounded hollow even to herself. But as she drove home through the rain-lashed streets of Tampa, doubt slithered in. What if they do? She'd staked her reputation on this case. Blown through savings fighting. Crestview's delays, and for what? A photo of a condo? A recording the court refused to hear? She'd been so sure the system would bend to the truth. But the system wasn't broken. It was occupied. Her phone buzzed. A text from her former chief of staff. "Saw the news? Let it go. You're outgunned." By midnight, she was pacing her kitchen, Crane's sneer replaying in her mind. Outgunned. The word stuck. She'd spent decades in the machine, polishing its gears, never noticing the rot in its bones. Now the machine was eating her alive. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo on her desk. Bondi at 35 standing beside her first major conviction, a Ponzi schemer who'd preyed on retirees. Back then she'd believed justice was a scalpel, precise, clean. Now? It was a rusty hammer swung by men like Crane to crush anyone who threatened their feast. A knock startled her. Maria stood on her porch, drenched, clutching a manila folder. "They served me papers," she said, voice raw. "They're accelerating the debt. I have 72 hours. Bondi scanned the documents. Ice flooded her veins. Crestview wasn't just seizing Maria's home. They'd attached a lien to her nursing license. "They can't do this," she hissed. Maria laughed bitterly. "They are." In that moment, Bondi saw herself reflected in Maria's despair. The same helpless fury she'd buried for years. The late nights justifying compromises. The deals cut with developers like Voss to keep the economy moving. The quiet shame of playing the game. Go home, Bondi said suddenly. Pack a bag for you and the kids. Now. Why? Because tomorrow I'm burning it all down. The plan crystallized in the hollow hours before dawn. Bondi sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of evidence Crane had barred her from presenting. Emails, shell company ledgers, the damning condo deed. She'd played by the rules, and the rules had failed. But rules, she realized, were just suggestions written by winners. Time to rewrite them. She logged into an encrypted chat, her fingers trembling, not with fear, anticipation. The username waiting for her. Newsbreaker 77, Bondi. You still willing to publish off the record? A pause. Then. Newsbreaker 77. Depends. You finally ready to stop protecting the monsters? She attached the files. Every shred of Crestview's corruption, Crane's backroom deals, Voss's threats, and one new addition, a sworn affidavit from a Crestview whistleblower, a terrified accountant who'd slipped Bondi his contact info during a recess. Bondi, run it. All of it. Newsbreaker 77. They'll come for you. Bondi, let them. She leaned back, pulse roaring. This wasn't a legal strategy. It was a declaration of war. By sunrise, the story would be everywhere. Social media, cable news, the whispers of clerks in courthouses from Miami to D.C. Crane could silence a courtroom, but not the world. Maria called at 5:17 a.m. They're here. Men in suits. They say I have to leave. Turn on the TV. Bondi interrupted. A click. A gasp. On screen, Newsbreaker 77's expose unfolded like a detonation. The condo deed, the whistleblower's testimony, Voss's voice on tape, Crane's, my dog. He'll bark if I tell him to. Maria sobbed. They're leaving. The suits, they're on their phones. They look scared. Bondi closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she smiled. The system hadn't just failed her. It had trained her, and now class was in session. The storm hit at 8:03 a.m., not the kind with rain, the kind with hashtags. By the time Judge Crane lumbered into his courthouse, Crane the Crook was trending in 14 countries. Protesters clogged the streets, waving signs, plastered with his daughter's Miami condo. News vans circled like vultures. Inside, his clerk handed him a resignation letter, unsigned. They're saying the FBI's involved, she muttered, avoiding his eyes. Crane's phone buzzed. Text from Roderick Voss, fix this, but some fires can't be smothered. Bondi arrived at the courthouse flanked by Maria and a phalanx of reporters. No power suit today, just a sharp black blazer and a smile that could cut steel. Blythe waited at the defendant's table, jaw clenched, his tan fading to gray. The gallery, packed, not with suits, with nurses, teachers, single parents clutching printed memes of Crane's face photoshopped onto a rat. All rise. The bailiff's voice trembled. Crane took the bench, but the room didn't stir. A teenager in the front row kept chewing, eyes locked on her phone, his courtroom, his rules, and yet, Bondi stood. Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to introduce new counsel for the plaintiff. The doors burst open. A woman strode in, mid-50s, steel gray bun, a scar slicing through her brow. Lena Reyes, special prosecutor for the DOJ. The same woman, who'd put away 3 governors and a cartel kingpin. The crowd erupted. Crane's gavel froze mid-swing. Judge Crane, Reyes said, tossing a subpoena onto his bench. You're hereby recused and detained. Maria gasped. Blythe lunged up. On what grounds? Reyes didn't blink. Conspiracy, bribery, and, tax evasion. She nodded to the back. 2 federal agents stepped forward, cuffs gleaming. But Bondi wasn't done. She turned to Blythe, her voice sweet as arsenic. Your client, Mr. Voss, he's in the Caymans, yes, private jet? Shame the FAA grounded it. She slid a document across the table. A seizure order for every Crestview asset, signed, sealed, and delivered by a judge who wasn't on Voss's payroll. Blythe's hands shook. You can't. I didn't, Bondi said. You did. She tapped the Crestview logo on his briefcase. Your firm's server logs? They show you knew about the forged debt transfers, which makes you complicit, and, she added, leaning in, your offshore accounts? The ones in your nanny's name? Reyes has those too. The room spun. Blythe collapsed into his chair, tie askew. Maria reached for Bondi's hand, but Bondi was already walking toward Crane. The judge's jowls quivered. You'll regret this, Pam. I have friends. You had friends, Bondi corrected. She glanced at Reyes, who nodded. On the courthouse steps, Reyes addressed the cameras. This isn't just about one case, it's about a system that's been weaponized against the vulnerable. Today we begin dismantling it. Behind her, agents led Crane away, his robes billowing like a deflated sail. But the knockout punch came at dusk. A live stream flickered to life on Newsbreaker 77's channel. Roderick Voss, pale and sweating, sat in a Caymanian airport lounge screaming into his phone. I own half the Senate, you can't do this. The camera panned to Interpol agents, their badges catching the Caribbean sun. Mr. Voss, one said, you're under arrest. The clip went nuclear. Memes merged Voss's face with Bernie Madoff. TikTok teens remixed his meltdown into dance tracks. And Maria Gonzalez? She stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by her kids, as Bondi handed her a check, $1.5 million, clawed back from Voss's frozen accounts. For the house, Bondi said. And college funds. Maria stared at the number. This is too much. Bondi shook her head. It's yours. In the shadows, Bondi watched Crane's bail hearing. On a courthouse TV, his wife, draped in fur, sobbed into a handkerchief, the same woman who'd once snubbed Bondi at a fundraiser. Karma's a ballet, Bondi thought. So delicate, so brutal. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You're next. She deleted it, smiled. Typed a response to Newsbreaker 77. Ready for round 2? Because this wasn't an ending, it was a blueprint. The whistleblower accountant. Granted immunity. The nurses Crestview had bankrupted. Organizing a class action. And Judge Crane's seat. Soon to be occupied by a former public defender. A single mom who'd spent years fighting. Evictions. Bondi stepped into the sunset, the chants of the crowd at her back. Pam, Pam! Pam! She didn't turn. Hunters, after all, never look back. Not when there's fresh prey ahead. The sentencing hearing lasted 7 minutes. Judge Harold Crane, stripped of his robes and reduced to an orange jumpsuit, stood shackled in the same courtroom where he'd once sneered at Bondi. The new judge, a woman whose son he'd once sentenced to juvie for stealing bread, read the verdict without inflection. 42 months for bribery, 87 months for conspiracy, to be served consecutively. The gallery erupted. Crane's wife fainted. Bondi, seated in the back, didn't clap. She watched as the man who'd called the law a game for winners shuffled out, head bowed, a marshal's hand on his elbow. 11 years, she thought. Enough time to learn how the other half lives. Roderick Voss fared worse. Extradited, bankrupt, and abandoned by his friends in the Senate, he pleaded guilty to 47 counts of fraud. His sentencing photo broke the internet. The billionaire, now paunchy and gray, gripping a styrofoam cup of prison coffee. Commenters photoshopped it onto mugs, t-shirts, and a viral TikTok trend. Sip like you stole millions. His assets? Seized. His legacy? A half-built Miami skyscraper repurposed into affordable housing. The ribbon-cutting ceremony featured Maria Gonzalez and her kids. This place, she told the cameras, is for families like mine, the ones they tried to bury. But the sweetest justice was quieter. Carter Blythe, disbarred and divorced, spent his days hustling DUIs in a strip mall office. One afternoon, a woman walked in, a waitress sued for medical debt. Blythe didn't recognize her, but she recognized him. Hard to find good help these days, huh? She said, dropping a copy of Bondi's memoir on his desk. He closed early. For Bondi, the victory wasn't in headlines or book deals. It was in the flood of letters, nurses, teachers, a teenager who'd beaten a predatory loan with Bondi's blueprint. "You made them scared," one wrote. "Thanks for that." But the real change was systemic. The Bondi Act sailed through the state legislature, banning judges from owning corporate stock, mandating transparency in political donations, and capping interest rates on medical debt. At the signing ceremony, Bondi stood beside Maria and the whistleblower accountant, now a financial crimes consultant. No confetti, no fanfare. Just the scratch of a pen rewriting rules she'd once helped weaponize. 3 years later, Bondi returned to Crane's old courtroom. Not as a lawyer, a spectator. The plaintiff? A single dad fighting a hospital's bogus $50,000 ER bill. The judge? The former public defender, now sporting Crane's bench. The defense? Attorney objected, citing procedural precedent. The judge leaned forward. "Let me stop you there. Ms. Bondi." Bondi stood, pulse quickening. "Would you explain procedural precedent to our friend?" She smiled. Gladly. The system wasn't fixed, not yet. Lobbyists gnawed at the Bondi Act, new Vosses sprouted like weeds. But the playbook had changed. Bondi's memoir, The Trap, sat on nightstands in law schools and trailer parks. Her nonprofit trained paralegals to fight predatory loans. And every time a corrupt judge retired or a loan shark folded, the obituaries carried the same whisper. They crossed Pam Bondi. On Maria's daughter's graduation day, Bondi sat in the back row. The valedictorian speech echoed across the football field. "My mom taught me that justice isn't a gift. It's a fight. And sometimes you get to win." Maria squeezed Bondi's hand. No words needed. The final scene wasn't televised. Bondi stood at Crane's prison visitation window. He'd requested the meeting. Begged, really. Why? He rasped, aged a decade in 3 years. "You knew how it worked. You were one of us." She studied him, the sagging skin, the dead eyes. A man who'd confused power with invincibility. "I was," she said. "Then I remembered something." "What?" "The law doesn't belong to you." She stood, leaving him gripping the phone. "It belongs to them." Outside, the sun blazed. Protesters chanted at a loan office down the street. A teen handed Bondi a flyer. "Stop Crestview 2.0. She tucked it into her purse. Round 3, she thought, and smiled. Epilogue. Power isn't seized, it's reclaimed. One case, one whistleblower, one angry mom in a courtroom. So the next time they tell you it's hopeless, that the game's rigged, the odds unbeatable, the giants unstoppable, remember Pam Bondi, remember Maria, and ask yourself, who's holding the match?